The 72nd floor of Sterling Enterprises gleamed like a crown atop New York's skyline, its glass walls reflecting the city's restless pulse under a shroud of neon lights. Edward Sterling, 48, and impeccably tailored in a bespoke, charcoal suit sat at his desk, a monarch in his sterile kingdom. His fingers danced across the keyboard, approving budgets and skimming shareholder reports, but his gaze drifted to the window, where the horizon swallowed itself in shadow. The office was a cathedral of ambition. Marble floors, minimalist steel furniture, and a single framed photo of him shaking hands with a senator. Yet, beneath the crisp hum of efficiency, there was a silence that gnawed at him, a hollow ache he couldn't name. His left hand brushed against a worn silver pen in his pocket, a relic from a life he'd buried 20 years ago. Anna Harper had given it to him, her fingers trembling as she pressed it into his palm with a smile that promised forever. He'd been 28 then, a dreamer with a law degree and a hunger for more. But Margaret Sterling, his mother, had seen Anna as a shackle, a small-town girl with no pedigree to match the dynasty she envisioned. "She'll drag you down, Edward," Margaret had warned, her voice a blade wrapped in silk. So he'd walked, away, choosing the cold glow of these lights over the warmth of Anna's eyes. Now, the pen was all that remained, a quiet reprimand he couldn't discard. "I don't belong to the past," he muttered, shoving it deeper into his pocket. Downstairs, in the dimly lit canteen on the ground floor, Anna Harper moved with the steady grace of someone who'd learned to carry the world on her shoulders. At 43, her hands were rough from years of scrubbing floors and wiping tables, her dark hair streaked with gray and pinned back in a practical bun. She wore a faded blue uniform, her name stitched in white thread over her heart, but her eyes, sharp and unyielding, held a fire that poverty couldn't douse. Beside her, on a plastic chair too big for his small frame, sat Tommy, her 5-year-old son. His sneakers dangled above the floor, and his head rested against her arm as she hummed a lullaby under her breath, coaxing him to sleep. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered, brushing a lock of brown hair from his forehead. "Mama couldn't find anyone to watch you tonight." Her shift had started an hour ago, and with no babysitter, she'd had no choice but to bring him along. The canteen was quiet now, the last of the late-night staff gone, leaving only the hum of vending machines and the faint clatter of her cleaning cart. She smoothed his jacket, her calloused fingers lingering on his cheek, and for a moment her face softened, a rare glimpse of the girl she'd once been. Tommy stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Can I play, Mama?" he asked, voice thick with sleep. Anna hesitated, then nodded. "Just stay close, okay?" He slid off the chair, his sneakers squeaking as he darted toward the hallway, a bundle of restless energy in a world too big for him. She watched him go, a faint smile tugging at her lips, until the clink of a spilled mop bucket snapped her back to work. Edward stepped out of the elevator, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor of the lobby. He'd stayed late, to review a merger proposal, and the building felt like a ghost town at this hour. As he crossed toward the exit, a smudge caught his eye, a trail of tiny, muddy footprints marring the pristine hallway. His jaw tightened. This was his domain, a testament to discipline and order, and someone had dared to defile it. "Who's responsible for this?" he barked, his voice echoing off the walls. Before he could finish, a small figure barreled around. The corner, a boy, no more than 5, with wild brown hair and a grin that lit up the sterile space. Tommy didn't slow as he crashed into Edward's legs, wrapping his arms around them like they were an anchor. "Be daddy," he chirped, his voice high and clear, cutting through the silence like a bell. Edward froze, the words slamming into him with the force of a freight train. His breath caught, and for a split second, the world tilted. The boy's arms were warm, his grip unyielding, and Edward's mind scrambled to make sense of it. He looked down, and there they were. Those eyes, bright, blue and piercing, a mirror to his own youth, staring back with an innocence that pierced his armor. "Tommy!" Anna's voice cracked like a whip as she rushed from the canteen, her cleaning rag still clutched in one hand. She dropped, to her knees, pulling the boy away with a force born of panic. "I'm so sorry, sir," she stammered, her face flushed with shame. "He's just tired. He doesn't know what he's saying." She yanked Tommy behind her, shielding him as if Edward were a storm about to break. But Edward didn't move. He couldn't. His gaze locked on Anna, and the years peeled away. The curve of her jaw, the defiance in her stance. It was her. The woman he'd walked away from, now kneeling before him in a janitor's uniform, her hands trembling, but her chin held high. And the boy, Tommy, clung to her skirt, peering up at Edward with those haunting eyes. "Who taught him to say that?" Edward asked, his voice low and sharp, each word a blade honed by years of control. He needed an answer, a tether to pull him back from the edge of something he couldn't name. Anna met his stare, unflinching despite the tremor in her hands. "I didn't teach him anything," she said, her tone steady but laced with something deeper. Pain, perhaps, or pride. "Maybe he sees what you don't." The words hung between them, heavy and electric, as the cold lights buzzed overhead. Edward's hand slipped into his pocket, fingers closing around the silver pen. His chest tightened, a crack forming in the wall he'd built around his past. Anna rose, pulling Tommy close, and turned to leave, her silhouette fading into the shadows of the canteen. But those eyes, Tommy's eyes, stayed with him. A quiet accusation burning through the sheen of his perfect world. He stood alone in the hallway, the muddy footprints at his feet no longer an offense but a question. Who was this child? And why, after all these years, did the past feel so close it could touch him? The executive boardroom on the 72nd floor was a fortress of glass and steel, its long table gleaming under stark white lights that cast no shadows. Edward Sterling stood at the head, his posture rigid, a man carved from the same cold precision that defined Sterling Enterprises. But today, the room felt too small, the air too thin. Tommy's voice, "Be Daddy," echoed in his skull, a persistent drumbeat he couldn't silence. His hand rested on the edge of the table, fingers trembling slightly as he gripped a coffee mug, the black liquid inside gone cold. He'd summoned Anna here, not as a CEO commanding an employee, but as a man grasping for answers he wasn't sure he wanted. The door clicked open, and Anna Harper stepped in, her blue uniform stark against the room's sterile elegance. She carried herself with a quiet defiance, her shoulders squared despite the weight of years etched into her skin. Tommy wasn't with her. Left with a coworker in the canteen, she'd said curtly over the intercom. And Edward was grateful for that. Those eyes would have undone him again. She stopped a few feet away, arms crossed, her gaze steady but guarded. The silence stretched, taut as a wire, until Edward broke it. Why did he say that? His voice was low, controlled, but the faintest crack betrayed him, like a fault line running through granite. He set the mug down, too hard, and coffee sloshed onto the polished wood. "Why did your son call me that?" Anna didn't flinch. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment she seemed to weigh her words, testing their edges before letting them fall. "You left me 20 years ago, Edward," she said, her tone even but laced with a bitterness that time hadn't dulled. "You walked away because I wasn't good enough for your world. I wrote to you, told you I was pregnant. You never answered. So don't stand there asking me why Tommy said what he did. Ask yourself why you didn't know." Her words hit him, like a fist, precise and unyielding, stripping away the layers of denial he'd built over decades. Edward's mind reeled, clawing through memories he'd locked away. Anna at 23, her laughter soft as summer rain, her hands warm against his as they sat on a park bench dreaming of a life that didn't involve boardrooms or stock tickers. And then Margaret's voice, icy and resolute. "She's a distraction, Edward. Cut her loose, or you'll never rise." He'd chosen ambition, convinced himself it was strength, not cowardice. But a letter? He didn't remember a letter. "I didn't get it," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. His hand slipped into his pocket, brushing the silver pen, a lifeline he clung to without knowing why. "I swear, Anna, I didn't know." She studied him, her eyes narrowing as if searching for a lie she expected to find. Then she shook her head, a faint, bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You didn't know because you didn't want to," she said. "I sent it to your apartment, your mother's place. You were still living there, weren't you? Before all this." She gestured vaguely at the room, the lights, the empire he'd built. "I waited for months, nothing, so I stopped waiting. Tommy and I, we've been fine without you, we don't need you now." The finality in her voice was a wall, and Edward felt it rise between them, impenetrable. He wanted to argue, to demand proof, but the tremor in his chest held him back. Anna turned to leave, her footsteps soft but deliberate on the marble floor. "Keep your kingdom, Edward," she said over her shoulder. "It's all you've ever cared about." The door closed behind her, a quiet thud that reverberated in his bones. Edward sank into the chair at the head of the table, his hands pressing against his temples as the room spun. A letter, sent to his mother's apartment. Margaret had managed his mail back then, screened it, she'd said, to keep him focused. He'd trusted her, handed over pieces of his life without question. Had she seen it? Had she buried it? He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, and strode to the elevator. The ride home was a blur. 40 minutes across Manhattan, to the penthouse he'd bought after Sterling Enterprises went public. It was a museum of his success, all sharp edges and muted grays, but tonight it felt like a mausoleum. He went straight to the study, a room he rarely used, and pulled open the bottom drawer of an oak desk. Inside was a box, small, unassuming, filled with relics he'd never bothered to unpack after moving out of Margaret's place years ago. His fingers shook as he lifted the lid. Old photos, a college tie, a ticket stub from a concert he'd attended with Anna, and there, tucked beneath a faded newspaper clipping, an envelope. The paper was yellowed, the edges brittle, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Anna's. His name scrawled in her careful looping script, Edward Sterling. No stamp, no postmark. She delivered it herself, slipped it into the mailbox of the Upper East Side brownstone where he'd lived under Margaret's roof. He tore it open, the sound sharp in the stillness. A single sheet of paper unfolded. In his hands, the ink faded but legible. "Edward," it began. "I don't know how to say this, so I'll just write it. I'm pregnant. It's yours. I don't expect you to come back. I know you've made your choice, but I thought you should know. Our child deserves that much." Anna. The paper slipped from his fingers, drifting to the floor like a leaf caught in the wind. Edward stared at it, his chest tight, his breath shallow. 20 years, 5 years of Tommy's life. He'd missed it all, not because he'd chosen to, but because someone had chosen for him. Margaret's face flashed in his mind, her stern jaw, her unyielding gaze, and a question burned through the fog of shock. What else had she hidden? He picked up the letter again, clutching it as if it could anchor him. Anna's words replayed. "We don't need you now." And they stung, not with anger, but with a truth he hadn't faced. He'd built an empire on discipline, on control. But what had it cost him? The silver pen gleamed in his pocket, a silent witness to his failure. Outside, the city lights pulsed, indifferent to the man unraveling beneath them, a king confronted by the ruins of a life he'd never known he'd lost. Edward Sterling hadn't slept. The penthouse, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and panoramic view of Manhattan's glittering sprawl, felt like a cage. He sat on the edge of a leather sofa, the letter from Anna crumpled in his fist, its words seared into his mind. "Our child deserves that much." The silver pen lay on the coffee table, catching the faint glow of dawn creeping through the glass. Tommy's eyes, those vivid blue mirrors of his own youth, haunted him, flickering in every shadow. He'd stared at them in the boardroom, unblinking and pure, and now they wouldn't let him go. He pulled an old photo from his wallet, one he'd kept despite himself, a faded Polaroid of him at 25, grinning on a Coney Island pier, with salt-streaked hair and a sunburned nose. The resemblance was undeniable. Tommy had the same sharp jaw, the same spark in his gaze. Edward's chest tightened, a vice of regret squeezing out the air. He'd spent 2 decades building Sterling Enterprises into a titan of industry, every decision calculated, every emotion suppressed. Control was his mantra, his shield. But now, that shield was cracking, and he didn't know how to hold it together. By mid-morning, he was back at the office, but the 72nd floor felt alien. The merger reports on his desk blurred into nonsense, and the hum of the air conditioning grated like an accusation. He needed proof, something concrete to tether the chaos in his head. He called his lawyer, a discreet man named Grayson, and arranged for a DNA test. No publicity, Edward instructed. His voice clipped. Just results fast. Grayson didn't ask questions, he never did. That was why Edward paid him. But waiting wasn't enough. He had to see them, Anna and Tommy, again. Not in the sterile boardroom, but in their world. He left the office at dusk, bypassing his driver and taking a cab instead, an anonymity he rarely allowed himself. The address was easy to find. Grayson had pulled it from payroll records, a crumbling brick tenement in Brooklyn, its fire escape rusted and sagging. Edward stood across the street, hands in his coat pockets, the silver pen a cold weight against his chest. The building was a far cry from his penthouse, its windows patched with cardboard, its stoop littered with cigarette butts. Yet, through a cracked pane on the second floor, a warm light spilled out, soft and defiant. He crossed the street, drawn by that glow. Through the window, he saw Anna in a cramped kitchen, her silhouette framed by a flickering fluorescent lamp. She was stirring a pot on a stove that looked older than she was, her movements slow but deliberate. Tommy sat at a wobbly table, coloring with a stubby crayon, his tongue poking out in concentration. Edward's breath caught as Anna turned, reaching for a pair of worn sneakers on the counter. She knelt beside Tommy, slipping them onto his feet, her hands gentle as she tied the frayed laces. "We'll fix these tomorrow, okay?" she murmured, brushing his hair back. Tommy nodded, oblivious to the holes in the soles. Edward's throat burned. This was their life, threadbare, fragile, but alive with a warmth his penthouse lacked. He'd offered billions to shareholders, signed contracts that shaped skylines, but he'd never thought to offer anything to them. Not until now. He stepped back into the shadows, the DNA test suddenly feeling like a coward's move. He didn't need science to tell him what his heart already knew. The results came 2 days later, delivered in a sealed envelope to his desk. Edward opened it alone, the office lights dimmed to a twilight hum. 99.9% probability of paternity. The numbers stared back at him, stark and final. Tommy was his son, 5 years old, 5 years of first steps, first words, first dreams. Gone. He pressed the paper flat, his hand steady now, as if the truth had anchored him at last. He returned to Brooklyn that night, the cab dropping him a block away. The rain had started, a fine mist that clung to his coat, but he didn't care. He climbed the tenement stairs, each creak a reminder of how far he'd fallen from this place, and knocked on Anna's door. She opened it, her face hardening at the sight of him, a dish towel slung over her shoulder. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low to keep from waking Tommy. Edward swallowed, his throat dry despite the damp. "I know he's mine," he said, holding up the DNA report, though he didn't hand it over. "I didn't know before, Anna. I swear it. I want to help. Money, school, whatever you need." Anna's eyes flashed, a storm brewing behind them. She stepped forward, closing the gap between them, her voice a quiet blade. "You think money buys back 5 years of him asking where his dad is? 5 years of me lying to him because I couldn't say you didn't care enough to stay?" She shook her head, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "We don't need your pity, Edward. We've made it this far without you." The words cut deeper than he'd expected, not with anger, but with their raw honesty. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. Control was all he had left. "I'm not offering pity," he said, his tone steady despite the ache in his chest. "I don't know how to start, Anna, but I want to try. Not with money, with time, if you'll let me." She stared at him, her gaze searching for something, truth maybe or regret. Then she stepped back, the door still open but the wall between them unyielding. "Time's not yours to give anymore," she said. "It's his to take, or not." She nodded toward the small figure asleep on a threadbare couch, Tommy's chest rising and falling under a patched blanket. Edward followed her gaze, and there they were again, those eyes, closed now but no less potent. He turned away, the rain soaking through his coat as he descended the stairs. The DNA report was still in his hand, damp and crumpled, but it wasn't the proof he carried with him. It was the image of Anna tying those broken laces, of Tommy sleeping under her care, a life he'd missed, a question he couldn't answer. What have I been living for? The silver pen weighed heavy in his pocket, a compass pointing back to a road he'd abandoned. He didn't know where it led, but for the first time in years he wanted to find out. Edward Sterling stood in the glass-walled lobby of Sterling Enterprises, the dawn light filtering through in pale streaks. The muddy footprints from Tommy's shoes were gone, scrubbed away by some unseen hand, but their ghost lingered in his mind. The DNA report sat folded in his jacket pocket, a silent weight beside the silver pen, a twin burden of truth and regret. He'd spent the night replaying Anna's words, "Time's not yours to give anymore." They echoed through the hollow spaces of his penthouse, a verdict he couldn't appeal. Yet, here he was, back in his tower, the king of a kingdom that suddenly felt like a mirage. The morning passed in a blur of meetings, but Edward's focus frayed. His assistant buzzed about a shareholder call, but all he could see was Tommy asleep on that threadbare couch, Anna's hands tying those broken laces. He'd offered help, money, resources, and she'd thrown it back in his face. Not out of spite, he realized, but pride. A pride he'd once admired, now turned against him. He rubbed his temples, the silver pen cold against his fingers as he pulled it from his pocket. He needed a plan, a way to bridge the gap, but before he could think, the storm broke. The first sign came at noon, when Grayson, his lawyer, called. "It's out," Grayson said, voice clipped. "Someone's talking. Page 6 has a headline, Sterling CEO's secret love child. They've got photos, blurry, but it's you outside that tenement." Edward's stomach dropped. He hung up, pulling up the article on his laptop. There it was, a grainy shot of him on Anna's stoop, rain-soaked and staring up at her window, captioned with speculation that could sink empires. The phone rang again. Margaret, his mother. Her tone, Arctic. "What is this mess, Edward? Fix it, now!" He didn't have time to respond before the boardroom filled with whispers. Robert Kane, a former rival turned minority shareholder, strode in uninvited, his smirk sharp as a blade. Robert had lost a hostile takeover bid to Edward a decade ago, a wound that never healed. Now, he smelled blood. Trouble in paradise. "Sterling?" he drawled, tossing a printed copy of the article onto the table. The board's rattled. Shareholders are calling. A bastard kid's not exactly the image we sell. Edward's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady, a lifetime of discipline holding him in check. "It's a rumor, Kane, nothing more. I'll handle it." Robert leaned closer, his breath sour with coffee and malice. "Handle it fast, or I'll make sure they vote you out. You're not untouchable anymore." He left, the threat hanging like smoke, and Edward felt the walls of his world tremble. By afternoon, the lobby swarmed with reporters, their cameras flashing through the glass like a relentless storm. Edward watched from his office, the city skyline blurring beyond the chaos. His assistant fielded calls, CNBC, Bloomberg, tabloids, all clamoring for a statement. Margaret arrived an hour later, her silver hair immaculate, her eyes cold as the marble beneath her heels. She shut the door behind her, her voice a hiss. "This is a disgrace, Edward. The Sterling name is everything. Your father's legacy, my life's work. You will not let some janitor and her brat tear it down." "They're not some janitor and her brat," Edward said, his tone even but edged with steel. "Tommy's, my son. I have proof." He tapped the DNA report on his desk, watching her reaction. Margaret's face didn't change, but her fingers tightened around her purse. "Then deny it," she snapped. "Pay her off, shut her up, whatever it takes. Honor isn't sentimentality, it's survival." Edward stared at her, the woman who'd shaped him into this, ruthless, unyielding. "And if I don't?" he asked, testing her. She met his gaze, unflinching. Then you'll lose everything I built for you. Don't be a fool. He didn't answer. Instead, he took a cab back to Brooklyn, the reporters trailing him until he lost them in the maze of side streets. Anna's building loomed under a gray sky, its bricks stained with years of neglect. He climbed the stairs again, his coat still damp from the night before, and knocked. She opened the door, her expression shifting from surprise to wariness. "What now?" she asked, stepping aside. To let him in. The apartment smelled of soup and damp plaster, Tommy's crayons scattered across the table. "They know," Edward said, pulling the article from his pocket and handing it to her. "The press, the board. Someone leaked it. They're saying things about you, about Tommy. I need you to deny it, Anna, for his sake." Anna scanned the page, her lips tightening as she read the lies. "Gold digger. Scandal," splashed across the print. She set it down, her hands steady, and looked at him with a fire he hadn't seen since their youth. "You want me to lie?" she said, her voice low but fierce. "To say he's not yours, that I'm some nobody chasing your money? I've spent 5 years keeping my head up, Edward, working nights, stitching his clothes, telling him he's enough. I won't trade my dignity for your reputation." Her words were a slap, not of anger but of truth. Edward felt them settle into him, heavy and unshakable. He'd come here to protect her, or so he'd told himself, but it was his world he was, shielding. His name. His control. "I'm trying to fix this," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "I don't want him hurt." "Then don't ask me to erase him," she replied, stepping closer, her eyes locked on his. "You've hidden from this long enough. If you want to help Tommy, face it. Don't bury it." The room fell silent, the hum of the city muffled, beyond the thin walls. Edward nodded, a slow acknowledgement of her strength, his own weakness laid bare. He left without another word, the article crumpled in his fist. Outside, the press had found him again, their shouts. "Mr. Sterling, is it true?" ringing in his ears as he pushed through the swarm. Flashbulbs blinded him, but he kept his head high, his face a mask of calm. "I'll handle this my way," he said, loud enough for them to hear, though he wasn't sure yet what that meant. Back in the cab, the silver pen pressed against his chest, a reminder of the man he'd been. And the one he might still become. The spotlight burned, casting shadows he couldn't escape, but for the first time he didn't want to. Anna's refusal wasn't just defiance, it was a challenge. And Edward Sterling, the king of control, felt the first stirrings of a fight. He couldn't win with power alone. The rain came down in sheets, a relentless drumbeat against the glass towers of Manhattan. Edward Sterling stood at his office window, the 72nd floor a perch above the storm, watching the city blur into streaks of light and shadow. The silver pen rested in his hand, its weight a constant now, a tether to the chaos he couldn't outrun. The press had doubled their assault since yesterday. Headlines screamed Sterling scandal across every screen, and Robert Kane's taunts looped in his mind. "You're not untouchable anymore." Margaret's ultimatum, "Deny it or lose everything," hung like a guillotine. Yet Anna's words cut deeper. "Face it, don't bury it." He hadn't slept in days, but it wasn't fatigue that drove him now. It was her challenge, and Tommy's eyes, pulling him back to Brooklyn. He left the office without a word, forsaking the chauffeured car for a cab's anonymity. The driver barely glanced at him, a mercy in a world that wouldn't stop staring. The rain pounded the roof as they crossed the bridge, the city's glow fading into the gritty haze of Tenement Row. Edward stepped out a block from Anna's building, his coat soaking through in seconds, the silver pen a cold press against his chest. He didn't know why he'd come, only that he had to. The DNA report was proof, but it wasn't enough. He needed to see them, to feel the truth beyond paper and ink. The stairs creaked under his weight, the air thick with damp and the faint tang of mildew. He hesitated at Anna's door, the muffled sound of a cough seeping through the wood. His knock was soft, almost lost in the rain's roar, but the door swung open and there she was, Anna, her face etched with exhaustion, a damp dish towel slung over her shoulder. Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of surprise giving way to wariness. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low, as if guarding something fragile. Before he could answer, another cough rasped from inside. Tommy, curled on the couch under a thin blanket, his small frame shuddering with each breath. Anna's gaze darted to him, then back to Edward, her jaw tightening. "He's sick," she said, stepping aside reluctantly. "Fever started this morning. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Edward entered, the room's warmth a stark contrast to the chill clinging to his skin. The kitchen lamp flickered, casting a soft glow over the cluttered space. Crayons on the table, a pot of soup simmering on the stove. Tommy's sneakers by the door, their soles still patched with duct tape. He shed his coat, draping it over a chair, and moved closer to the couch. Tommy's eyes fluttered open, red-rimmed but bright, and a faint smile broke through his pallor. "You're the tall man," he murmured, voice hoarse. "Are you warm?" The question pierced Edward, simple and unguarded, stripping away the armor he'd worn for decades. He knelt beside the boy, his knees pressing into the worn rug. "I can be," he said, his tone softer than he'd intended. He glanced at Anna, who watched him with a mix of suspicion and something else, curiosity perhaps. She didn't stop him as he reached for a glass on the table, filling it with water from a cracked pitcher. He held it to Tommy's lips, steadying the boy's shaky hands as he drank. Anna moved to the stove, stirring the soup with a wooden spoon, her silence heavy but not hostile. Edward set the glass down and noticed a damp cloth on the armrest, its edges frayed. He picked it up, folding it with the precision of a man who'd never done this before, and pressed it to Tommy's forehead. The boy sighed, leaning into the coolness, and Edward's chest tightened, a pang of something he couldn't name, raw and unfamiliar. "Mama's been cold too," Tommy whispered, his eyes drifting shut. Edward turned to Anna, catching the slight shiver she tried to hide. Without a word, he stood and crossed to the stove, taking the kettle from the counter. He filled it, set it to boil, and pulled a chipped mug from a shelf. His movements were clumsy, unpracticed, but deliberate. When the water steamed, he poured it over a tea bag, some generic brand he didn't recognize, and handed it to her. "Drink," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Anna took the mug, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting second, warm against his cold skin. She didn't thank him, but her shoulders eased, and she sipped slowly, the steam curling around her face. "He likes stories," she said after a moment, nodding toward Tommy. "If you're staying, make yourself useful." Edward returned to the couch, sinking into the sagging cushions beside Tommy. "Once upon a time," he began, his voice low and steady, "there was a boy who lived in a tower. He thought it was the whole world. But one day, he found a door." The words came haltingly at first, drawn from a well of imagination he'd long forgotten, but Tommy's breathing evened out, a small hand resting on Edward's knee. Anna watched from the kitchen, her expression unreadable, the mug cradled in her hands. The rain pounded outside, a curtain between this fragile moment and the spotlight waiting to devour him. Edward finished the story, a tale of a boy who left the tower to find a home, and looked up to meet Anna's gaze. "If you want to be here," she said, her voice barely above the storm, "don't hurt him. He's all I've got." "I won't," Edward replied, the promise slipping out before he could weigh it. He didn't know how to keep it, not yet, but the weight of it settled into him, solid and real. Anna nodded, a silent truce, and turned, back to the stove. Tommy slept, his fevered warmth seeping into Edward's side, and for the first time in years, the cold lights of his world dimmed beneath something softer. He stayed until the rain slowed, the kettle empty, the soup pot cooling. When he left, his coat still damp, he carried the memory of Tommy's hand, Anna's quiet strength, and a question that wouldn't fade. Could time, his time, mean something to them? The silver pen pressed against his chest, no longer a relic, but a compass, pointing him toward a path he'd never dared to walk. Outside, the city loomed, its shadows sharper now, But Edward didn't flinch. Whatever came next, he'd face it, not as a king, but as a man. The gala at the Waldorf Astoria shimmered with the elegance of New York's elite, crystal chandeliers casting prisms over black ties and sequined gowns, the air thick with the clink of champagne flutes and the murmur of power. Edward Sterling stood near the edge of the ballroom, his tuxedo pristine, the silver pen tucked into his breast pocket like a silent ally. He'd come because the board demanded it, a show of strength amid the spiraling scandal, but every smile he forced felt like a lie. The press had quieted momentarily, but Robert Kane's threats and Margaret's icy warnings lingered, a noose tightening around his neck. Tommy's fevered warmth, Anna's steady gaze. They clung to him too, a lifeline he couldn't shake. Sipped his scotch, the burn grounding him when Robert Kane appeared, cutting through the crowd like a shark scenting blood. His gray suit was sharp, his grin sharper, and the gleam in his eyes promised trouble. "Enjoying the spotlight, Sterling?" he said, voice loud enough to turn heads. He held a champagne flute, twirling it lazily. "Or is it getting a little too hot up there on your throne?" Edward's jaw clenched, but he kept his tone even, the discipline of decades holding firm. "If you've got something to say, Kane, say it. I'm not here for games." The room buzzed around them, a sea of curious glances, but Edward stood, tall, his face a mask of calm. Robert smirked, stepping closer, his breath sour with alcohol. "Oh, I've got plenty, but let's start with this. Your mother didn't trust you to handle your own trash." The words landed like a punch, but Edward didn't flinch. "Meaning what?" he asked, his voice low, a thread of steel running through it. Robert's grin widened, savoring the moment. "Meaning Margaret paid me to bury that little janitor's letter 20 years ago. $5,000 to keep her precious boy clean. She knew you'd buckle under a kid. Too soft, too sentimental. Guess she was right, huh? Look at you now." The foe. Room tilted, the lights too bright, the chatter too loud. Edward's hand tightened around the glass, knuckles whitening, but he didn't swing. He couldn't, not here, not with every eye on him. Robert's words sliced through years of trust, exposing a betrayal he hadn't dared to imagine. Margaret, his rock, his guide, hadn't just hidden the letter. She'd orchestrated its silence, paid a man like Kane to erase his son. His pulse thundered, but he kept his gaze steady, locking onto Robert's smug face. "You're lying," he said, testing the ground, though the tremor in his chest told him otherwise. "Am I?" Robert laughed, a harsh bark that drew more stares. "Ask her yourself. She's over there sipping gin and pretending she's still in charge." He gestured toward the bar where Margaret stood in a silver gown, her posture regal, her eyes fixed on them. "She wanted you spotless, Sterling. No dirty laundry to drag down the empire. But now, you're a mess, and I'm just here to watch it burn." Edward turned, his movements deliberate, and crossed the ballroom. The crowd parted, whispers trailing him like smoke. Margaret met his gaze as he reached her, her glass paused mid-sip, her expression unreadable. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice a quiet blade, cutting through the din. "Did you pay him to hide Anna's letter?" Her lips thinned, a flicker of something, guilt perhaps, crossing her face before she masked it. She set the glass down, her hand steady. "What's this nonsense, Edward?" she said, her tone dismissive, but he saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers curled too tightly around her clutch. "Don't," he said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Don't lie to me. Not now. Did you pay Kane to keep me in the dark about my son?" The word, son, hung between them, heavy and raw, a line he'd never crossed with her before. Margaret's eyes flickered, then hardened. She straightened, her voice low but firm. "Yes," she said, the admission cold and unapologetic. "I paid him $5,000 to make sure you didn't throw your life away on some girl and her mistake. I did it for you. For us. Your father walked away from me when I needed him most, left me to claw my way up alone. I wouldn't let you repeat that weakness." The confession hit Edward like a wave, not with rage, but with a profound, aching clarity. He didn't shout, didn't lash out. Control was his refuge, even now. He saw her then, not as the invincible matriarch, but as a woman scarred by abandonment, her love twisted into manipulation. "You didn't protect me," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "You stole from me. 5 years of my son's life. Time I can't get back. That wasn't your choice to make." Margaret's face faltered, a crack in her armor, but she recovered quickly. "I made you what you are," she said, her tone rising. "A leader, not a fool chasing sentiment. You'll thank me when this blows over." "No," Edward said, turning away, his back to her. "I won't." He walked through the gala, the lights blurring into a haze, Robert's laughter fading behind him. The silver pen pressed against his chest, a reminder of the man he'd been, and the one he'd failed to become. Margaret's betrayal wasn't just a secret. It was a mirror, reflecting the cost of the life she'd built for him. But it wasn't her words, or Kane's, that drove him now. It was Anna's. "Face it. Don't bury it." He stepped into the night, the rain gone, the air crisp and biting. The press waited, cameras flashing, but he didn't stop. "No comment," he said, his voice calm, his stride unbroken. They shouted questions. "Is it true? Who's the kid?" But he kept moving, the spotlight a shadow he no longer feared. Inside, the truth burned. Tommy was his, and Margaret had known. She'd paid to keep him invisible, a transaction as cold as the empire he ruled. But there was more. Anna's silence, her strength. Had she known about Kane? Had she fought this alone? Edward's hand closed around the pen, its edges digging into his palm. He wouldn't bury it. Not anymore. Whatever came next, he'd face it with the dignity Anna had shown, the honor he'd lost. The gala's lights faded behind him, but ahead, in the quiet of Brooklyn, a small pair of eyes waited, eyes he wouldn't let slip away again. Edward Sterling stood in the sterile glow of his office, the 72nd floor a silent witness to the storm brewing below. The city lights pulsed beyond the glass, but they offered no comfort, only a reminder of the empire teetering beneath his feet. The silver pen lay on his desk, its sheen dulled by the fingerprints he'd left over sleepless nights. Margaret's confession at the gala, "I paid him," had cracked something inside him, not with rage, but with a quiet, searing clarity. She'd stolen Tommy from him, 5 years of a life he'd never known, and now the world was closing in to claim the rest. The press had escalated their siege since the gala, headlines screaming "Sterling's secret son" across every outlet. The photos were sharper now, Edward leaving Anna's tenement, his face etched with a vulnerability he couldn't hide. Shareholders demanded answers, their emails flooding his inbox with threats of divestment. Robert Kane had fueled the fire, whispering to the board about instability and poor judgment. But it wasn't the company that weighed on Edward's mind as he stood there, staring at the pen. It was Tommy's fevered sigh, Anna's unshakable resolve, and the choice he hadn't yet made. His assistant buzzed the intercom, voice clipped. "Mr. Sterling, your mother's here, and Kane's on his way up." Edward nodded, though she couldn't see it, and braced himself. Margaret swept in first, her silver hair a crown, her eyes cold as the marble floor. "This ends today," she said, her tone a command. "You'll deny it, publicly, unequivocally, or I'll call an emergency board meeting myself. Kane's ready to push for a vote." Before Edward could respond, Robert Kane entered, his gray suit rumpled from a night of scheming, his grin a blade unsheathed. "She's right, Sterling," he said, leaning against the desk with casual menace. "The stock's dipping, 5 points already. You're a liability now. Cut the kid loose or I'll make sure you're out by week's end." Edward's hands curled into fists, the silver pen biting into his palm as he picked it up, but his voice stayed steady, a fortress of control forged over decades. "You don't get to decide my family, Kane," he said, locking eyes with the man who'd sold his son's existence for $5 grand. "And neither do you, Mother. This isn't about the company anymore." Margaret's face tightened, a flicker of disbelief breaking her composure. It's always about the company, she snapped. Your father left me nothing. Nothing but a name I built into this. You will not throw it away for some sentimental whim. It's not a whim, Edward said, his tone low but unyielding. It's my son. The words hung there, solid and real, a line he'd crossed without looking. Back, Margaret stared at him, her silence a storm of its own. But Robert laughed, a harsh, grating sound that filled the room. Touching, he sneered. But here's the deal. Walk away from the brat, or I'll bury you. I've got the votes. You're done. He stepped closer, his breath hot with triumph. What's it gonna be, Sterling? Your precious legacy? Or a kid you didn't even want? Edward didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. He met Robert's gaze, his calm, a weapon sharper than any shout. I'd rather lose the company than lose him twice, he said, each word deliberate, a vow carved in stone. Robert's smirk faltered, but Margaret's hand slammed onto the desk, the sound a gunshot in the stillness. You're a fool, she hissed, but Edward turned away, his decision made. He left them there, Kane gloating, Margaret seething, and took a cab to Brooklyn, the silver pen a steady pulse against his chest. Anna's building loomed under a gray sky, the rain a memory in the puddles at its base. He climbed the stairs, the creak of wood a familiar ache, and knocked. She opened the door, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. Before he could speak, she stepped aside, revealing Tommy on the couch. Not asleep this time, but shivering under a blanket, his coughs ragged and wet. He's worse, she said, her voice breaking. I couldn't get him to the doctor, reporters everywhere. They're calling me a gold digger, Edward. They're scaring him. Edward crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling beside Tommy. The boy's eyes fluttered open, glassy with fever, and a weak smile tugged at his lips. Tall man, he rasped, his hand reaching out. Edward took it, small and hot in his grip, and felt the weight of 5 lost years crash into him. I'm here, he said, his voice soft but firm, a promise he wouldn't break. Anna sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she clutched a damp cloth. They followed us home, she said, staring at the floor. Kids at school teased him. He fell running away. I can't protect him from this. Her words were a plea, not for help, but for an end to the chaos Edward's world had unleashed. He stood, pulling his phone from his pocket. I'll get a doctor here, he said, dialing Grayson with a calm he didn't feel. Private, discreet, no one will know. Anna nodded, too tired to argue, and Edward stepped into the hall to finish the call. The doctor arrived within the hour, a gray-haired woman with a black bag and no questions, diagnosing pneumonia, prescribing antibiotics, and leaving as quietly as she'd come. When she was gone, Edward sat beside Tommy, the boy's breathing easing under the blanket. Anna watched from the kitchen, her silence heavy with unspoken words. They want me to deny him, Edward said, breaking the quiet. Kane, my mother, they'll take everything if I don't. Anna's eyes met his, fierce despite her exhaustion. And you? She asked, her voice a challenge. What do you want? Edward looked at Tommy, then back at her, the silver pen warm in his hand now. I want him safe, he said. I want you both safe. I've hidden too long, faced nothing but my own shadow. I won't do it again. She held his gaze, searching, then nodded, a small, reluctant trust. Tommy stirred, his hand finding Edward's again, and the room filled with the sound of his shallow breaths. Outside, the city roared. Cameras, threats, a legacy on the brink. But here, under the flicker of a cheap lamp, Edward felt something shift. The lights of his empire burned bright, but they couldn't touch this. A boy's trust, a mother's strength, a chance he wouldn't let slip away. Whatever it cost, he'd pay it. Not with money, but with the man he was finally becoming. The press conference room at Sterling Enterprises buzzed with a restless energy, its white walls stark under the glare of overhead lights. Edward Sterling stood at the podium, his tuxedo replaced by a simple gray suit, the silver pen tucked into his pocket like a talisman. Cameras lined the back, their lenses trained on him, a pack of wolves waiting for blood. The board had called. This, Margaret's doing no doubt, demanding a public reckoning after days of relentless headlines. Sterling's fall, they dubbed it, the stock plummeting 7 points since Tommy's existence hit the news. Robert Kane sat in the front row, his smirk a silent gloat, while Margaret stood off to the side, her silver hair glinting. Like armor, her eyes fixed on Edward with a mix of expectation and dread. He'd spent the morning at Anna's apartment, watching Tommy's fever break under the doctor's care. The boy had slept, his small chest rising and falling with a steadiness that eased the knot in Edward's gut. Anna had stayed by his side, her hands steady as she adjusted his blanket, her silence a fortress he hadn't breached. "I'll fix this," he'd told her before leaving, and she'd nodded, not with hope, but with a weary acceptance he intended to prove wrong. Now, here he was, facing the world he'd built, ready to tear it down. Edward cleared his throat, the sound sharp. In the hushed room, "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice calm, a bedrock of control honed over decades. "There's been speculation, rumors about my personal life, my leadership. I'm here to set the record straight." He paused, scanning the faces, reporters, shareholders, Kane's predatory grin, and felt the silver pen press against his chest, a quiet anchor. "5 years ago," he said, "I made a choice I didn't know I was making. A woman I loved, Anna Harper, wrote to me, telling me she was pregnant with my child. I never saw that letter. It was hidden from me, buried by someone I trusted." His gaze flicked to Margaret, who stiffened, her lips parting in silent protest. The room erupted in murmurs, cameras clicking, but Edward pressed on, his tone unwavering. "That child is Thomas Harper. Tommy. He's my son. The DNA proves it, but I don't need a test to know the truth. I see it in his eyes every time. I look at him." The whispers grew louder, a wave crashing against his resolve, but he stood firm. "I've spent my life building Sterling Enterprises," he continued, "and I've been honored to lead it. But I've learned something these past weeks. Honor isn't a title or a stock price. It's not a name on a building. It's the responsibility we carry for the people we love, the ones we've failed. I failed Tommy, I failed Anna, and I won't fail them again." Robert Kane leaned forward, his voice cutting through the din. "So what, Sterling? You're throwing it all away for a kid you just met? The board won't stand for this." His taunt was a dare, but Edward didn't rise to it. He met Kane's stare, his calm a shield no provocation could pierce. "I'm stepping down," Edward said, the words ringing clear and final. "Effective immediately. I'm resigning as CEO of Sterling Enterprises. My shares will be sold, the proceeds placed in a trust for Tommy's future, not as a payment, but as a promise. I've asked too much of others to protect what I thought was mine. It stops here." The room exploded, gasps, shouts, questions hurled like stones. "Why now? Who takes over? What about the shareholders?" Edward raised a hand, silencing them, his authority unshaken even as he relinquished it. "I'm not running," he said. "I'm choosing. That's all you need to know." He stepped away from the podium, the cameras flashing in a frenzy, and walked past Kane, whose smirk had vanished, replaced by a flicker of unease. Margaret grabbed his arm, her grip iron. "You're destroying everything," she hissed, her voice trembling with something like fear. Edward looked at her, not with anger but with a quiet resolve she couldn't touch. "No, Mother," he said. "I'm saving what matters." He left the building, the press trailing him until he slipped into a cab, the silver pen warm in his hand now. The ride to Brooklyn was a blur, the city's roar fading as he climbed Anna's stairs one last time as the man he'd been. She opened the door, her face wary, Tommy's crayons still scattered on the table behind her. "It's done," he said, stepping inside. "I told them. He's mine. I'm out. The company's theirs." Anna's eyes widened, searching his. "You gave it up?" she asked, her voice soft, almost disbelieving. Edward nodded, pulling a folded paper from his pocket, the trust document, signed and notarized. "For him," he said, "not to fix the past, but to be here now." She took it, her fingers brushing the page, But before she could speak, she set it down and crossed to a drawer. She pulled out an envelope, yellowed, unsealed, and handed it to him. "I wrote this too," she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "After the first letter, I never sent it. I didn't think you'd care." Edward opened it, the ink faint but clear. "Edward, I could have taken money from Kane, 10 grand to disappear. I didn't. Not because I wanted you back, but because I wanted Tommy to have a father worth knowing someday. Maybe that's you, maybe it's not. Anna." The twist hit him like a quiet thunderclap. Not Margaret's betrayal, but Anna's sacrifice. She'd turned down a lifeline to protect his dignity, a choice he hadn't earned. His knees buckled and he sank to the floor, the letter trembling in his hands. "I didn't know," he said, his voice breaking for the first time. "I don't deserve this, any of it, but I'll spend my life trying to, if you'll let me." Anna knelt beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, not with forgiveness but with a tentative trust. "It's not about deserving," she said. "It's about showing up." Tommy's cough echoed from the couch, softer now, and Edward looked up, his eyes wet but clear. The lights of his old world burned out there, but here, under the flicker of a Brooklyn lamp, a new one began, a sacrifice not of loss, but of letting go, a step toward the man he'd always meant to be. The autumn sun dipped low over Brooklyn, casting a golden glow across the row of tenements, their chipped bricks, softened by the light. Edward Sterling stood on the stoop of a modest brownstone 2 blocks from Anna's old apartment, his gray coat unbuttoned, the silver pen now a familiar weight in his pocket. It had been 3 months since the press conference. 3 months since he'd walked away from Sterling Enterprises, sold his penthouse, and traded the cold lights of Manhattan for this quieter corner of the world. The trust for Tommy was secure, the proceeds from his shares a lifeline he'd ensured would grow with the boy. But it wasn't money that brought him here today. It was something simpler, something he'd spent a lifetime learning to value. Inside, the brownstone smelled of fresh paint and cinnamon. Anna had agreed to the move, not for luxury, she'd insisted, but for Tommy's health, away from the damp and mildew of their old place. Edward had bought it outright, a small gesture among the many he'd made since that night he'd knelt with her letter in his hands. The living room was sparse but warm, a second-hand couch, a wooden table Tommy had already scratched with his crayons, a lamp that cast a soft, steady glow. Edward set a bag of groceries on the counter, milk, bread, a jar of honey, and turned, as Anna emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You didn't have to," she said, nodding at the bag, her tone firm but softer now, the edges of her wariness worn smooth by time. Her hair was loose today, streaks of gray catching the light, and her eyes held a cautious peace. Edward smiled, a small, unguarded curve of his lips. "I know," he said, "but I wanted to." It was their rhythm now, small acts, quiet words, a bridge built one step at a time. Tommy bounded in from the hallway, his sneakers squeaking on the hardwood, his cough a distant memory replaced by a grin that lit the room. "Tall man," he chirped, crashing into Edward's legs with the same fearless trust that had started it all. Edward knelt, ruffling the boy's hair, and handed him a toy car from his pocket, a red one, simple but sturdy. "For you," he said, his voice low and warm. Tommy's eyes widened, and he darted off to test it on the floor, leaving a trail of laughter behind. Anna watched, her arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "He's calling you that, Les," she said, glancing at Edward. "Sometimes it's just you now." Edward nodded, rising to his feet. "I'll take it," he said, and meant it. He wasn't daddy yet, not fully, but every moment with Tommy chipped away at the years he'd lost, carving a place he hadn't dared to hope for. They moved to the kitchen, where Anna poured tea, real tea this time, not the generic bags he'd fumbled with that rainy night. Edward took the mug, his fingers brushing hers, and they sat at the table, the hum of Tommy's play filling the silence. "I saw the papers," she said after a sip, her tone casual but pointed. "Stock's back up. Kane's running things, now." Edward shrugged, the weight of his old life a shadow he no longer carried. "He can have it," he said. "I kept the name off the headlines. That's what matters." He'd faced the press again after resigning, a brief statement to shield Anna and Tommy from the spotlight. "My family's private, leave them be." It had worked, mostly. The cameras had faded, the story growing cold without his fuel. Anna set her mug down, her gaze steady. "You didn't have to give it all up," she said, echoing their talk from months ago. "Not for us." Edward leaned forward, his hands clasped around the warm ceramic, his voice quiet but firm. "I didn't," he said. "I gave it up. For me, for the man I should have been. You and Tommy, you just showed me who that was." Before she could reply, the doorbell rang, a sharp chime that broke the moment. Anna frowned, rising, and Edward followed her to the door. Margaret stood there, her silver hair dulled by the overcast sky, her hands clutching a scarf instead of her usual clutch. Her eyes flicked from Anna to Edward, then down to Tommy, who'd trailed them, clutching his car. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice softer than Edward had ever heard it. Anna stepped aside, her silence an invitation, and Margaret entered, her presence a strange fit in the small space. She looked at Tommy, her gaze lingering on his face, Edward's face, 20 years younger, and her hand trembled slightly as she reached out. "You're like him," she said, almost to herself. "Like your father was." Tommy tilted his head, curious but unafraid, and pressed the car into her palm. "It's fast," he said, grinning. Margaret's lips parted, a breath escaping, and she knelt, her knees stiff but willing. "Thank you," she whispered, holding the toy as if it were glass. She looked up at Edward, her eyes wet but clear. "I was wrong," she said, the words raw, unpolished. "I thought I was saving you. I didn't see what I took." Edward nodded, not with triumph, but with understanding. "I know," he said, "but it's not too late." Margaret rose, her hand resting briefly on Tommy's shoulder, a bridge mended, however fragile. Later, after she'd gone, Edward took Tommy to the park, Anna walking beside them. The boy ran ahead, leaving footprints in the damp earth, and Edward matched them, step for step under the fading light of street lamps. Anna slipped her hand into his, a quiet gesture, not of absolution, but of presence. "Honor's here," Edward said, glancing at her, then at Tommy. "Not up there." She squeezed his hand, her voice a whisper against the breeze. "Then stay here, don't go back." He didn't need to answer. His footprints beside Tommy's were promise enough. Back at the brownstone, they sat under the lamp, Tommy asleep between them, his car clutched tight. The city's lights glowed in the distance, but they were far away now, overshadowed by the steady warmth of this small, imperfect home. Edward traced the pen's outline in his pocket, no longer a relic of loss, but a marker of what he'd found, a life not of power, but of purpose, etched in the footprints he'd finally learned to follow.